Click mute. Good evening. My name is Antonio Caffey, and I'm a very proud member of St. Mark's Lodge number 7, located in Columbus, Ohio. I have the very distinct honor and pleasure this evening of presenting the history of St. Mark's. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a past master of the lodge. I also have served our Grand Lodge as its Grand Historian, and I was the first director of the Masonic Education Department. I am also the founder of the Prince Hall Think Tank, which is a monthly conversation amongst Prince Hall Freemasons where we discuss Freemasonry. That show is on YouTube. You can check us out. It's the last Sunday of each month at 8:30. Just do a search for the Prince Hall Think Tank, and you'll see get information about upcoming episodes as well as past episodes as well. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our most worshipful Grand Master, the Honorable Jerry Ellerson, as well as our current worshipful Master of St. Mark's, Worshipful Brother Worston Snowden. Before I begin this evening, I just want to take this time to dedicate tonight's presentation to three very special brothers, past masters John A. James, Clarence W. Davis, and Will Simpson. Past masters Davis and Simpson have gone on to greater rewards, but their presence, along with past master James, is still felt within our lodge to this day. They, along with other stalwarts of our lodge, made a very, very, very strong impression upon a very young 22-year-old almost 30 years ago. And I would not be the Mason and man that I am today if it weren't for those three men. So again, this show is dedicated to those three brothers. So when we talk about the history of St. Mark's, before we can get into the history, we need to discuss and talk about Columbus during that time. So during the mid to late 1800s, Columbus was becoming a very, very big city. It had business districts, government buildings, theaters, transportation systems, and whatnot. Around 1850, the railroad, that's when the railroad came to Columbus, and it created a huge demand for material and labor. So Columbus grew from a very tiny frontier settlement town to a bustling, growing city within a 60-year time span. So during that time, there weren't, or early in the 1800s, there weren't too many blacks living in Columbus prior to 1810. During the War of 1812, you started to see a lot of formerly enslaved Africans started to arrive and settle in Columbus. Ohio was a very interesting state during this time. Although slavery was prohibited in Ohio, the state did not stop those that enslaved Africans from bringing their enslaved Africans as they passed through or visited the state. So they didn't stop them and say, "Hey, you can't, bring the person that you're enslaving into our state," or if you're passing through or visiting it, they allowed that to take place. So Columbus actually also during that time, it had, one of the large black population prior to the Civil War. It had the largest black population than any other northern city. That fact is made Columbus a good place for those that were seeking freedom as well to hide. Because of that large black population they had, someone could escape and automatically just fit right in to the general black population in Columbus. So you have to look at all of this through the context of what was going on in Ohio and in the United States at that time. Again, while Ohio was considered a free state, the black laws that existed within Ohio that were enacted around 1803 seriously limited the activities of what free African Americans could do within the state. So upon entering the state, some of these black laws that they made every black person was required, or it meant every black person was required to post a bond for $500 and file evidence of their free status. African Americans were also not permitted to work unless they carried documentation of their free status with them. Also, African Americans were also denied the opportunity to send their children to public schools. So during this time as well, you had local chapters of the the American Anti-Slavery Society and its affiliate, the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society, began to grow, as did other anti-slavery societies within the state as well. So by the late 1830s, there were more than 200 anti-slavery organizations in Ohio. 1849, though Ohio's black laws were partially repealed, meaning that African Americans were no longer required to post bond or register their freedom papers. So while all of this was going on within the state of Ohio and within the United States, the fraternity of free and accepted Masons amongst men of color had existed for a little over 60 years. Connecting blacks in various states, it truly became the first interstate organization amongst people of color in the United States. In 1849, 3 Masonic lodges who were assisted in being created by Martin R. Delaney, which is pictured there, who's considered the father of black nationalism, came together in the city of the city of Cincinnati, to form the first Prince Hall Grand Lodge west of the Allegheny Mountains in Ohio. This Grand Lodge played a very, very important role in the growth of Freemasonry throughout the United States for African Americans by forming lodges in various states. So during around 1852, the Grand Master during that time, which is the chief executive of the Grand Body, was Most Virtual Griffin C. Watson, the person to your right. He had received a petition from various Freemasons of color in the city of Columbus to form a Masonic lodge. He granted those men permission to create the first Prince Hall Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons in the city of Columbus. St. Mark's became the 4th lodge formed in the state of Ohio by the Prince Hall Grand Lodge, Ohio. And on January 16th, 1852, St. Mark's held its first meeting in Columbus. The first officers of St. Mark's were Charles M. Langston, pictured above left, David Jenkins, who's our senior warden, pictured below left, and our junior warden was Hanson Johnson. Again, you have to wrap all of this into my favorite term, historical context, to understand it. So to understand the time period in which this lodge was formed, the year again was 1852. The majority of African Americans living in the United States during this time were enslaved. Blacks had little, if any, rights that whites had to respect both in the South and the North. While Ohio, again, was a free state, blacks still had to contend with the racism, segregation, and other discriminatory practices. So with this backdrop, many of our early members were heavily involved in the abolitionist movement, as well as helping to ease the burdens of blacks within the city of Columbus. I'd like to briefly discuss a few of those brothers at this time. Brother David Jenkins, pictured there, was born in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1811. Various times in Brother Jenkins' life, he was a farmer, barber, paper hanger, and painter. Most of his time, resources, and his passion was spent as an operator in the local Underground Railroad. Brother Jenkins was a recruiter for the 127th Ohio Infantry during the Civil War and was then appointed to the Freedmen's Bureau in Mississippi. He came to Columbus in 1837, where he became a leading participant in the civil rights activity. During a meeting of the Lincoln Memorial Club, Peter H. Clark pictured next to Brother Jenkins, who was also a Prince Hall Freemason and one of Ohio's most effective abolitionist writers and speakers, and who was the founder and principal of Ohio's first public high school for Black students in 1866, had this to say about David Jenkins, quote, "At a time when several of the members of this club were yet unborn and others were infants, David Jenkins commenced working with an earnest, unselfish zeal for his people. At first, little could be done in the way of politics, but there were schools to be established and maintained. The Underground Railroad was in full blast and demanded conductors who had nerve and heart. In such work, Mr. Jenkins won himself an honorable fame among his people and gained that influence among them which he has for so many years exercised with honor to himself for their benefit," unquote. In 1838, David Jenkins established the Palladium of Freedom, the first newspaper by a Black person in Ohio and among the first in the country. Another early brother of note was the first worshipful master of St. Mark's, Brother Charles H. Langston. Charles Langston was born in Virginia as well in 1817. After his parents died, he and his brothers moved to Oberlin, Ohio, to live with family friends. Charles Langston in 1836 established one of the first schools in Ohio in Chillicothe for African-American children. He was a member of the Liberty Party and the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. Brother Langston was appointed principal of the Columbus Colored School in 1856, and like David Jenkins, he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Brother Langston was involved in I love telling this story whenever I have the opportunity. But Brother Langston was actually involved in a very, very interesting incident just 6 years after St. Mark's was founded. On September 13th, 1858, an enslaved African by the name of John Price from Marysville, Kentucky, who had escaped, was arrested actually by a United States Marshal in Oberlin, Ohio. During this time, the fugitive slave law stated that any enslaved African that had escaped to Ohio or any other parts of the country up north could actually be arrested and returned into slavery. With Oberlin literally being what I call at that time the capital of abolitionist thought and activism in the U.S., the U.S. Marshal thought that it would be best to take Mr. Price to Wellington, Ohio, and then back to Kentucky and back into enslavement. Well, some residents heard about this and what happened, and went to the hotel that the U.S. Marshal, some of his deputies, and Mr. Price was being held. They demanded that they free him, but that request went unanswered. So then the men just bum rushed into the hotel, subdued the U.S. Marshal and his deputies, took Mr. Price and returned him back to Oberlin. And then from there, Charles Langston arranged for his transportation to Canada and then, to freedom. So out of the 37 men that participated in the rescue, all 37 men that participated in the rescue were indicted for violating, again, the fugitive slave law. When the federal grand jury returned the indictments, this is very interesting as well. The state of Ohio actually arrested the federal marshal, his deputies, and the other men that were involved in the abduction of John Price. So through negotiations between the state officials and federal officials, they agreed to arrest the deputy and the U.S. Marshal, and the federal officials agreed to drop the charges and release 35 of the 37 men. Charles Langston, however, and another gentleman by the name of Simeon Bushnell were both tried for violating that law, and they were convicted. Because of the sentiment of the time and where the trial was held, the judge gave both men life sentence Bushnell got 60 days, and Charles Langston got 20 days. So, as I stated earlier, when talking about Charles Langston, when I said when his parents died, he and his brothers moved to Oberlin to stay with family friends. His youngest brother was actually John Mercer Langston, pictured here, who was also a member of St. Mark's Lodge as well. John Langston was one of the first African Americans in the United States elected to a public office when he was elected as a town clerk in Ohio. He is he's the first known African American to apply to an American law school. He was admitted to the Ohio bar in 1854, the first Black to do so. In 1868, Brother Langston moved to Washington, D.C. to establish and serve as the founding dean of Howard University's law school. I'm proud to say my daughter will be attending Howard in the fall, so go Bisons. And this was actually the first law school, the first Black law school in the country, and he was the founding dean. He was also appointed acting president of Howard University in 1872. So again, these men, along with countless others, aside from forming St. Mark's Lodge, they truly cared about the conditions of African Americans, both in Columbus, the state of Ohio, and the United States. So if you were to look at our lodge's roster, not only during that time, but even present, but especially during that time, and you were to compare the list of, if you compare the roster of our lodge to a list of prominent African Americans in the city of Columbus, a lot of times you'll see a lot of the same names on both lists. And I like to highlight two of those brothers right here, Brother Hanson Johnson, that's on the right, and Brother James Poindexter on the left. Brother Johnson served as worshipful master of St. Mark's from 1871 to 1873. Past Master Johnson was a barber, and he was said to be the wealthiest Black community member in Columbus, with a property valued at roughly $12,000 in 1860. His expertise, both as a business owner and property owner, definitely served the lodge well. Brother James Poindexter was another member who stood tall in the face of adversity by being another conductor on the Underground Railroad. He supplied horses and materials to escaped enslaved Africans and assisted them in their journey towards freedom, both settling in Ohio and moving on to Canada as well. During the Civil War, Brother Poindexter and his wife formed the Colored Soldiers Relief Society because it was due to the lack of support for African American soldiers by the state of Ohio. In 1880, he became the first African American elected to the city council. He also was appointed to the Columbus Board of Education in 1884 and named to the board of directors of the State Forestry Bureau in 1896. And lastly, he was appointed to the board of trustees of Wilberforce University. So as the turn of the century approached, early 1900s, St. Mark's continued to play a vital role in the Black community in Columbus. Again, because of the oppression that many Blacks still faced in this country, African Americans found themselves with very few outlets for entertainment and recreation. During this time, clear up until the 60s, the Masonic Lodge and the Black Church were two of the places where Black folks could find refuge and friendship and fellowship with each other. And those two entities played key roles in developing the Black community, not only again in Columbus, but throughout this country. St. Mark's continued to play a major role in Ohio as well in advancing Prince Hall Freemasonry. On November 18th, 1913, St. Mark's inaugurated the first of the Masonic schools, and brothers from around the state and the jurisdiction actually traveled down to Columbus to learn the proper way to do degree work. Charles Wesley, the famed historian and who wrote our first Grand Lodge history book, said on that day when he was discussing that day on September 18, 1913, that the halls of St. Mark set a high standard for degree proficiency that day. So ever since St. Mark's was formed, the brothers back then had a passion and a proficiency for doing degree work, and that's been passed down to the current generations of brothers that fill the Lodge Hall as well. Between the years of 1914 and 1915, St. Mark's helped found two lodges in the jurisdiction, Menelik Lodge of Marietta, Ohio, and B.K. Bruce Lodge of Athens, Ohio. Also during this time in our history, members of St. Mark's actually helped craft our standard ritual, as well as the jurisdiction's funeral ritual, which we still use to this day. In 1919, Brother John C. Logan, pictured here, who served as St. Mark's worshipful master from 1913 to 1915, was elected to the office of Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ohio. He served in this capacity from 1919 to 1921. Past Grand Master Logan was described as a man of keen understanding, executive ability, and good fellowship. In 1919, Brothers of St. Mark's began developing the plan to build their own Masonic Hall in Columbus. Before our present building, brethren met on the second and third floors of the building that was located at 247 North 4th Street. A Go-Getters Club was organized in the early part of 1919, and it consisted of primarily the younger members of the lodge, with Brother John P. Bowles chairing the committee. The brothers had actually raised $4,000 by 1920, which was enough to make a down payment on a piece of property. So the committee then began looking for an appropriate site to build the lodge, and East Long Street in Miami was chosen. The selection of the site actually made sense because Long Street and in that whole area was the hub of Black activity in Columbus. The King, Lincoln, Brownsville section of the city was a self-sustained community with thriving businesses and churches. So it just made sense to have the lodge in the middle of the large Black community in Columbus. So all of that, being true. So again, the brothers raised the money. They found the land to build the lodge. There were still issues that Black folks had to deal with back then. The owner of the property told the brothers that, yes, the property is for sale, but he would not make a direct sale to those brothers because they were Black. He did, however, say that I can't sell it to you, but I can sell it to someone else. And then if they chose to sell it to you, then, so be it. So the committee actually found a white person to purchase the property. And on July 28th, 2020, the deal for the purchase of the property was completed. And the deed, luckily, and I always stress that, luckily, was turned over to St. Mark's, subject to a mortgage. The building was actually completed and the Lodge Hall was dedicated on January 15th, 1927, which was actually 75 years after the lodge was founded. The $30,000 mortgage was canceled and released in 1943. And at the time of its construction, St. Mark's Lodge Hall was the first newly constructed Masonic temple in Ohio. For those that have been inside the lodge hall before, there's actually a clock that sits on the wall above one of the doors within the lodge. The clock's previous location was actually on a building that was located at 247 North 4th Street. So it used to actually hang on the building that the brothers met in prior to meeting on Long Street. And if you look closely at the clock, you can actually see the address on the clock. And the brothers, it's my belief that the brothers bought that clock to them and had it hung in the lodge hall just as a reminder of where they came from and where they are presently are meeting at. So aside from serving as a meeting place for the lodge and other Masonic organizations, our lodge hall back then hosted big bands. A lot of famous acts came into town and performed in the lodge hall, and it gave the Columbus community a place for entertainment. Another prominent member of our lodge during this time, and it served the Columbus community, was Brother William A. Method. Brother Method was actually a Harvard-trained surgeon, and even with those credentials, he could not practice at certain hospitals in Columbus due to his race. This forced him and other Black physicians to actually, during this time, they would actually have to turn over their patients to white doctors if they need any type of surgical procedures, because Dr. Method and other Black doctors could not perform those surgeries in those hospitals. In 1920, he opened Alpha Hospital, which was located on Long Street, right down the street from St. Mark's Lodge, to serve the Black community. Dr. Method was known as the Dean of Negro Physicians and training several students in the practice of medicine. He employed several people in the area as well as the best surgeons of the city. Alpha Hospital expanded to Alpha Hospital Association, a social service agency with Dr. Method being the chief of staff. The Hospital Association conducted a nurses training school, which was one of the only places Blacks could complete a nursing course in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Method was also helped to establish the Spring Street YMCA at 5th and Spring, now known as Eldon W. Ward YMCA on Woodland Avenue. In 1949, St. Mark's once again had the pleasure of having one of its members elected as Grand Master. Brother A.J. Worsham, who served as Worshipful Master of St. Mark's Lodge from 1931 to 1933, was elected at the 100th Grand Communication of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ohio. Past Grand Master Worsham once stated, quote, "Every Prince Hall Mason ought to be an informed Mason, schooled in his history and tradition as well as in his rituals," unquote. During the 1950s also, St. Mark's membership reached an all-time high of 630 members. The old saying, and talking to some brothers, that were around during that time or heard about that time, was you should get to lodge meeting at least a half an hour or an hour early if you wanted to get a seat. Because there were a lot of brothers and we had, didn't have enough seat for 630 members. So that was definitely a high time in regards to membership. Again, at the 122nd Grand Communication of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge, Ohio, we had another brother, Brother K. Kenneth Williams, who was elected to serve as Grand Master. Brother Williams served St. Mark's as Worshipful Master in 1957. He also served as secretary of our lodge for a very extended period of time. And at that time, he had become the third member of our lodge to serve the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ohio as Grand Master. Also, Brother Williams instituted the protocol manual that we still use in our lodges throughout the state to this day. And he also demanded a very, very high degree of excellence in our ritualistic work, which, as I explained earlier, came from his membership or being a member within St. Mark's Lodge. So the 90s, and fast forward a little bit, the 90s, or during the 90s, we saw actually a renewed interest in St. Mark's by the Columbus community. More and more men, in particular, more and more young men, decided to petition the lodge for membership. I should know because I was one of those young men in the early 90s that petitioned the lodge for membership. But we had a lot of interest and a lot of good men, like I said, good young men decide to become members of the lodge. And again, at the 146th Grand Communication held in Columbus, Ohio, we were privileged to have one of our past masters, Brother Frederick E. Kelly, elected to serve as Most Worshipful Grand Master again. Another occurrence or thing that happened in the 90s, and it's very strange to say this in 2023, but it's true, and some of us, are around that still can remember when this was a novelty. But in 1997, St. Mark's became one of the first lodges within the state of Ohio to have its own website. Since it's been designed and went online, stmarks7.org has kept the lodge's membership as well as the greater Columbus community up to date on lodge functions and news. And it really serves as a gateway for men that are interested in finding out a little more about the lodge, because it delves into the history of the lodge and our traditions and different things like that. Again, during the 167th communication of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge, Ohio, in 2011, our very own Brother Johnny O. Pitts Sr. was elected Most Worshipful Grand Master. And at that time, he had become the 5th past master of our lodge, elected to this high honor. Past Master Pitts is who I affectionately call the Dean of Masonic Ritualistic Study within St. Mark's. And a lot of us owe great debt to this brother for helping us understand the passion that you should have when doing degree work. On August 6, 2019, Brother Chester C. Christie was installed as the 64th Most Worshipful Grand Master of the Most Worshipful Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Ohio. He was definitely well prepared for this honor, having served our lodge and this jurisdiction in a variety of roles. And if I say Past Master Christie, Most Worshipful Past Grand Master Christie also assisted a lot of us that came into the lodge during the 90s truly understand what it means to be a Prince Hall Freemason and how you should carry yourself, as well as the passion that you should have as well. So these brothers, since its founding, we've actually had 7 members of our lodge serve as Grand Master, 6 within the state that I mentioned during the presentation, and our first worshipful master, Charles Langston, eventually moved to Kansas and was elected as Grand Master of the Prince Hall Grand Lodge of Kansas. So we have 7 brothers, and that's a very, very something that we're very proud of, because that means that we've had a tradition for a very long time of training men, equipping them to not only lead the lodge, but go on and lead one of the oldest jurisdictions within all of Prince Hall Freemasonry. So this year, on January 15th, 2023, St. Mark's actually celebrated our 171st year of existence, 171 years. Now, if you ask the average Columbus citizen, they would probably they wouldn't be able to tell you that much about, the lodge. But those that are living in the community in which our lodge sits, they probably just say, oh yeah, those guys, that, they're in the black suits and they go up in the building, a couple times a month, they meet about something, but we don't know, what they're talking about or anything. And the interesting thing about that is, that's okay. St. Mark's in general and Prince Hall Freemasonry in particular, we've never really sought limelight. And, many of the men that I discussed this evening, they just went about their business of improving the communities in which they lived in, as well as improve themselves quietly. And that's the nature of Freemasonry, to really truly make a difference. But, you don't need sometimes the attention that, while you may deserve it, you're not concerned with that. It's about making an impact both within the community and your personal life. So I'd like to end the presentation this evening with a quote from past Grandmaster K. Kenneth Williams, when he said, during the Grand Lodge session, he said, "Prince Hall Masons cannot live by our past alone. We must revise and update our thinking so that it fits today's needs." And the evidence that we've been doing that in St. Mark's is the fact that, again, this year we've celebrated our 171st year of existence. So 171 years after we were founded, we're still here. So again, thank you. It was my pleasure to present this brief history tonight about St. Mark's. Have any questions or just want to learn a little bit more about our lodge, please visit our lodge website, stmark7.org. Have a great evening.